In the Santa Cruz Islands, wealth could fade while people were still depending on it. This was Tevau, long red feather money, wrapped in thousands of tiny feathers and recognized as binding wealth. These coils secured marriages, bought canoes, compensated injury, and marked alliances. Yet their authority rested on a fragile condition. The red had to remain visible, recognized, and trusted. The system worked only as long as color held, specialists continued, and memory preserved what each coil meant. Before coins, before banks, belief ruled the world. The Santa Cruz group did not need Tevau for ordinary exchange. Daily life still relied on barter: fish for root crops, tools for labor, goods for immediate use. But barter ended when the transaction ended. Marriage, compensation, prestige feasts, and alliance debts lasted longer. They required value that could remain after the moment of exchange had passed. Tevau supplied that missing layer. This was not currency in the modern sense. It was recognized obligation, made visible in feathers. Its production was tightly restricted. On Nendo, a small number of hereditary male specialists controlled the making of Tevau. One group trapped scarlet honey-eaters with bird lime, removed the brightest underwing feathers, and released the birds alive. Another prepared the base with wooden platelets, fiber, and layers of grey pigeon feathers. A final specialist fixed the red plumes one by one, bound the strips, and wound them around a bark core. A finished coil could contain 50 to 60,000 feathers. The process demanded hundreds of hours of inherited skill. Brighter and more uniform red produced a higher grade. 10 grades were recognized. Knowledge, bird access, labor, and public judgment were compressed into a single object. A coil was valuable not because it was easy to use, but because it was difficult to make and difficult to replace. That difficulty protected value, but it also limited the system. Output may have reached only about 20 coils per year. Supply could not rise whenever demand increased. If bird access, specialist knowledge, or shared grading weakened, the entire structure became harder to maintain. In bride wealth, the pressure became concrete. A groom's family normally presented coils in descending grade. The highest-ranking coil opened negotiation. Lower grades completed and sealed the alliance. The coils did not merely pass from one side to another. They proved that an obligation had been met in a form both families could recognize. But the proof itself aged. The red feathers continued to fade after the ceremony. A coil accepted at one grade might lose standing before it was used again. The alliance had been settled, but the object that recorded settlement kept changing. Time did not reset the system. It continued to act on wealth after people had already built obligations around it. Tevau also purchased high-status pigs for feasts, seaworthy canoes, specialist labor, and compensation for injury. In each case, it worked less like change than a public record of value transferred. Its force came from recognition. People accepted a coil because others had accepted it before, and because others were expected to accept it again. That expectation required constant reinforcement. The coils moved between households and islands within the Santa Cruz and Reef Islands network. They remained visible, inspected, compared, and judged. Sheen, redness, uniformity, and condition mattered. Public grading supported trust, but it also made weakness public. Everyone could see when value was slipping away. No authority could stop the feathers from fading. This is where the system becomes clearer and more constrained. Tevau allowed obligation to travel across time, but it required continuous recognition. Without recognition, the object remained, yet its claim on future exchange weakened. Value was not fixed inside the coil. It had to be renewed each time the coil appeared. For individuals, the burden could be immediate. A young man's family might spend years accumulating acceptable coils before marriage could proceed. Labor remained committed until the required grade and number were assembled. If birds became scarce, if specialists were unavailable, or if older coils faded too far, the delay did not erase the obligation. It extended it. A father who had invested years of work could hold wealth that was losing strength while he waited for the right moment to transfer it. The system bound human time to material decay. The obligation remained, even as the object carrying it changed. That tension gave Tevau its power. It converted scarcity, skill, ritual, and public recognition into symbolic wealth. It allowed communities without coinage, writing, or centralized monetary authority to organize major payments and long-term relationships. Barter handled daily needs. Tevau handled the longer arcs of marriage, compensation, status, and alliance. Yet the same qualities that made it meaningful also limited it. Production stayed local, knowledge stayed hereditary, supply stayed slow. Value depended on a color that could not be preserved indefinitely. Recognition had to be maintained across households, generations, and islands. At small scale, this burden could be managed. Beyond that, coordination became difficult to sustain. By the 1930s, only about 10 active producers were recorded. By the 1960s, fewer remained. Marriage obligations alone required a steady flow of high-grade coils, while feasts, canoes, labor payments, and fines added demand. Any disruption in birds, skilled families, or recognition moved through the social fabric. Shortage did not simply reduce supply. It delayed marriages, strained alliances, and made compensation harder to settle. A coil was valuable because people trusted the chain behind it. But that chain depended on living specialists, living birds, and living agreement. None of those conditions could be guaranteed forever. Tevau therefore reveals a precise stage in the history of money before coinage. It was not decoration, and it was not ordinary barter. It was symbolic wealth, a visible object that carried social force because people agreed to remember its labor, scarcity, and grade. It worked because value was seen, judged, and carried forward. But it could not remain sufficient forever. Its strength came from fragile conditions: color, expertise, supply, and shared memory. The more society depended on those coils, the more pressure fell on a production system that could not easily expand. The fading red that gave Tevau authority also exposed its limit. In the next episode, we will examine T-bricks, compressed currency. Through the way fragile, localized forms of value gave way to objects that could travel farther, last longer, and circulate with greater standardization.